The morning of my husband's one-year memorial, my sister-in-law stood in the middle of the family altar room, in front of 40 relatives who had come from 3 provinces, and said the words I will remember until the day I die. "You're getting old, sister-in-law. Living alone in a house this big is a waste. Starting tomorrow, you move to the back room behind the kitchen. I'm renovating the front of the house, turning it into a homestay for tourists." The incense smoke curled up from my husband's altar, thin gray ribbons rising past his photograph, past the bowl of fruit I had arranged that morning at 4 o'clock, past the small dish of rice I refilled every single day for 365 days. The smoke moved the way it always moved when the back door was open, when the wind came up from the rice paddies behind our house and pushed through the screen door, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and burning paper money from the neighbor's altar. 3 houses down, 40 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. I felt them, the way you feel sunlight on the back of your neck even with your eyes closed. My husband's cousins, the old men who had drunk rice wine with him for 40 years, the women who had helped me cook for his funeral, who had sat with me through 7 nights of mourning, who knew exactly how many years I had spent caring for this house, this family, this man whose photograph now watched all of us in silence. I did not raise my voice. I did not let my hands shake, though I felt something cold move through my chest, the way river water moves under ice in January. I looked at my sister-in-law, Sen, standing there in her good silk blouse, her hair freshly done for the occasion. Her chin lifted the way it always lifted, when she believed she had already won something. I smiled, just a small smile, one corner of my mouth, the kind of smile a teacher gives a student who has answered a question with great confidence and gotten it completely wrong. The room went quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Someone's spoon clinked against a bowl in the kitchen, too loud in the silence, and then stopped. Sen's confidence flickered, just for a moment, like a candle flame catching a draft. She had expected tears. She had expected me to protest, to plead, to remind everyone of my 40 years of marriage to her brother, my decades of service at the district pharmacy counter, my hands that had measured out medicine for half the people in this room, at one time or another. She had prepared herself for a fight. She had not prepared herself for silence. "Did you hear me, sister-in-law?" she said again, her voice a little sharper now, the way a knife sounds when it scrapes against a whetstone one time too many. "The back room. Starting tomorrow." I held her gaze. I did not look away. The way I never looked away from a customer who tried to argue with me about a prescription 40 years ago. The way I never looked away from anything in my life that needed looking at directly. "I heard you, Sen," I said, my voice even and quiet. The voice I had used my whole life to calm frightened patients and grieving families. "The back room. Tomorrow." That was all I said. I turned back to the altar, picked up 3 sticks of incense, and lit them from the small oil lamp that had burned beside my husband's photograph every day since the funeral. I pressed my palms together, bowed once, twice, 3 times, the smoke rising warm against my face, carrying the scent of sandalwood and something underneath it that I had always thought smelled like memory itself. Behind me, I heard the murmur of the relatives beginning again, careful and low, the way conversation sounds in a room where everyone is pretending not to have just witnessed something significant. Someone's chair scraped against the tile floor. A child laughed somewhere in the courtyard, unaware of anything, the way children always are. But I was no longer in that room. I was 12 months back, standing in this same spot, watching my husband's casket carried out through the front gate, while the whole village walked behind it in white mourning clothes, while the funeral drums beat slow and heavy against the gray morning sky, while I held myself together with nothing but the discipline of 40 years, spent never showing what I was truly feeling. I was further back than that, too. I was 30 years back, standing in my white pharmacist's coat behind the counter of the district clinic, counting pills into small paper envelopes, while my husband waited outside on his bicycle, patient as always, never once complaining about the hours I kept. I was further back still, a young bride walking into this house for the first time, my mother-in-law placing a bowl of sweet rice into my hands, and telling me that a house remembers everyone who has ever lived inside it, that the walls keep secrets the way a well keeps water, deep and quiet and waiting. I thought of something my mother used to say. An old saying. She repeated so often it had worn smooth in my memory, like a river stone. Still water runs deepest. I had heard it 1,000 times as a child, and never understood it until I was old enough to become the still water myself. Let Sen believe she had won something. Let her stand there in her good silk blouse, satisfied with herself, already planning where she would put the reception desk for her tourists. Let her think that an old woman who had spent 40 years measuring medicine, who had spent 40 years learning to read the things people didn't say as carefully as the things they did, would simply pack her bags and disappear into the back room, without a word. She had no idea what was sitting in the wooden box behind my husband's altar, wrapped in red cloth, untouched for 5 years. She had no idea what was coming. I finished my bows and turned around. The relatives were already drifting back into their conversations, into their tea and their gossip, into the comfortable forgetting that grief eventually allows. Sen was talking to someone near the door, gesturing toward the front room with the particular enthusiasm of a woman already redecorating a house that was not yet hers. I walked past her without a word, my slippers quiet against the tile, and went to check on the rice cooking in the kitchen, the way I had every single day of my married life. But my mind was already somewhere else entirely. My mind was already 5 years in the past, on an ordinary afternoon, when my husband had called me into this very altar room and asked me to witness something he said I would need someday, though neither of us knew exactly when that day would come. I just hadn't known it would come dressed in silk, smiling, calling itself family. 40 years is a long time to love one man. And I want to tell you about the years before any of this happened, before the back room and the silk blouse, and the smile that wasn't really a smile. I want to tell you about my husband, Kai, while he was still alive, while the house still smelled like his tobacco in the evenings, and his bicycle still leaned against the wall by the gate. We married when I was 23. I had just finished my training as a pharmacist in the city, and I came back to this district because my mother was sick, and because, if I am honest, because a tall, quiet man named Vu Din Kai had written to me twice, while I was away, careful letters in steady handwriting, asking nothing of me, except whether I had eaten enough and whether the city water agreed with my stomach. He was not a romantic man. He never once told me he loved me in those early years, not with words, but he built me shelves for my medicine bottles before we were even engaged, sturdy ones, sanded smooth, so I would never catch a splinter reaching for the aspirin. That was Kai. He showed his heart with his hands, the way many men of his generation did. And I learned to read him the way I learned to read prescriptions, carefully, patiently, understanding that the meaning was often in what wasn't written down. We built this house together, in our 2nd year of marriage, on land his grandfather had cleared 3 generations before. I remember mixing mortar with my own hands, while 7 months pregnant with our first child, my mother-in-law scolding me from the doorway, telling me to rest, and Kai quietly bringing me a stool to sit on instead of arguing with either of us. The walls went up slowly, brick by brick, the way most things worth keeping are built. I opened the district pharmacy counter the year our son was born, and for the next 31 years I stood behind that counter nearly every day, measuring out medicine for farmers with bad backs, for mothers with feverish children, for old men who came in, not really needing anything, but a few minutes of conversation, and someone willing to listen. I learned things behind that counter that no pharmacy textbook ever taught me. I learned to read a person's face, the way I read a prescription label, to notice the things they didn't say, the hesitation before a question, the way a hand trembled slightly when reaching for the money. Kai became chairman of our commune when he was 41. A position he held with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything else. He settled land disputes between neighbors who had been feuding for decades. He sat up late at night reading documents by lamplight, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, while I sat across from him grading nothing because there was nothing to grade, only listening to the scratch of his pen and the call of the nightjars in the bamboo grove behind our house. We were not a loud family. We were not a family that announced our love to the village the way some couples did, with gifts and grand gestures. Our love was quieter than that. It was found in the bowl of soup he always left for me when I came home late from the clinic, still warm under a cloth on the stove. It was found in the way I memorized which joints ached in the rainy season and which liniment worked best, the way I rubbed it into his shoulders every evening without him needing to ask. Sen, his younger sister, was a different kind of person entirely. Even back then, she had married young, married badly, a husband who drank and gambled away whatever she managed to save, and somewhere along the way, she had developed a particular hunger, the kind of hunger that comes from watching your older brother build something solid and lasting while your own life crumbled in your hands. She came to us often over the years, always with a reason, always needing something, and Kai, being Kai, always gave it. Money for her son's school fees. A loan that was never repaid for her husband's failed business venture. A place to stay for 6 months when her marriage finally collapsed entirely. I never said a word against any of it. It was not my place to question my husband's generosity toward his own blood. And besides, I understood something about Sen that perhaps even she did not fully understand about herself. She did not resent us because we had wronged her. She resented us because we had simply continued, year after year, to build something steady, while her own foundation kept giving way beneath her feet. Some people cannot forgive others for surviving what they themselves could not. Our son grew up and moved to the city for work, the way so many children do now, calling every Sunday evening, visiting twice a year with gifts that always seemed slightly too expensive, as though distance could be measured in money, and closed with enough of it. I did not blame him. The city offered things this district could not, and Kai and I had raised him to walk his own path, even if that path led him away from us. So it was just the two of us, growing old together in this house. We had built brick by brick, watching the bamboo grove behind the house grow thicker every year, watching the village change slowly around us, new motorbikes replacing old bicycles, a paved road replacing the dirt path that used to flood every rainy season. Kai's hair turned white before mine did. I used to tease him about it. The only kind of teasing either of us was really capable of. Gentle and quiet, the kind that made him smile without quite laughing. He would touch his temple and say that white hair was simply proof a man had thought hard about something worth thinking about, and I would tell him that in that case he must have spent 40 years thinking very hard indeed about absolutely nothing at all. He would laugh then, really laugh, and the sound of it would fill the whole house, would drift out through the open windows into the courtyard where the chickens scattered, startled, and somewhere in the bamboo grove, a bird would startle too, and lift into the gray afternoon sky. I did not know, in those ordinary afternoons, how precious the sound of his laughter would become to me. I did not know how many years I would spend afterward listening for it, in empty rooms, in the creak of the gate, in the particular silence that settles over a house once the person who filled it with sound is gone. I only knew, standing in our kitchen, on an unremarkable Tuesday 5 years before he died, that something in his face had changed. He came to find me while I was washing the rice for dinner, water running cool over my hands, and he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. "Doan," he said, using my name the careful, formal way he only used when something serious was coming. "I need you to come to the altar room with me. There is something I need you to witness." I dried my hands on my apron and followed him, the rice forgotten, the water still running behind us into the basin. And I had no idea, not the smallest idea, that the conversation we were about to have would become the only thing standing between me and everything Sen would one day try to take. The signs began 2 years before my husband died. Small things at first, things I might have dismissed, if I had not spent 31 years learning to notice exactly the kind of small things people hoped would go unnoticed. Sen started visiting more often. Not the old kind of visiting, the kind where she arrived with some new crisis and left with money folded into her purse, but a different kind, softer, more attentive. She brought fruit from the market. She sat with Kai for long afternoons, asking about his health, about his memories, about the old days when their parents were still alive. She brought her friend along sometimes, a man I had never met before, well dressed in a way that didn't quite belong in our district. With a leather briefcase he always kept close beside his chair. "This is Mr. Tuok," Sen told me the first time, her voice bright, with an enthusiasm that struck me as slightly too polished, like a coin rubbed smooth from too much handling. "An old friend of mine, a lawyer in the city. He's been helping families in the area with their paperwork. Land deeds, that sort of thing. So many old documents get lost or damaged over the years. You know. And then there's nothing but confusion for the children to sort out later." I poured tea for both of them and said nothing, but I watched the way Mr. Tuok's eyes moved around our front room, lingering on the carved wooden cabinet that had belonged to Kai's grandfather, on the framed certificate from his years as commune chairman, on the small altar in the corner with photographs of Kai's parents looking down on all of us with the particular patience of the dead. He was assessing the house. I knew that look. I had seen it before, decades ago, when a man came through the village, buying up old furniture and antiques for resale in the city, walking through people's homes with exactly that same expression, calculating value, behind a polite smile. Kai's health had begun its slow decline by then. Nothing dramatic, nothing that sent us rushing to the hospital, just a gradual diminishing, the way a candle burns lower without anyone quite noticing. The moment the flames started shrinking, he tired more easily. His hands, once so steady building shelves and settling land disputes, began to tremble slightly when he held his teacup. He started forgetting small things, where he had left his glasses, what day of the week it was, though his mind remained sharp on everything that truly mattered. Sharp enough that I never once doubted his understanding of what was happening around him. Sen seemed to sense an opening in this slow diminishing, the way water finds the lowest point in any landscape, without needing to be taught. "Brother," I heard her say to him one afternoon, her voice carrying through the thin wall between the front room and the kitchen where I was preparing his afternoon medicine, "you should think about making things simple, for everyone. Updating your paperwork while you still have the strength to do it properly. Mr. Tuok says it's very common, very normal, nothing to worry about. Just making sure everything is clear so there's no confusion later, so the family doesn't fight after you're gone." I stood very still in the kitchen, the small spoon of medicine motionless in my hand, listening the way I used to listen to a patient describe symptoms, gathering every detail before forming any conclusion. "What kind of paperwork?" Kai asked, and I could hear in his voice the particular weariness that had settled into him over the past year, a tiredness that made him agreeable to things he might once have questioned more carefully. "Oh, nothing complicated. Just a simple document, updating things, making everything fair for everyone in the family. Mr. Tuok has all the forms ready. It would only take a few minutes of your time." I brought the medicine in then, interrupting them, perhaps more deliberately than I let myself admit at the time. Sen's smile flickered when she saw me, the same flicker I would see again, larger and more permanent, on the day of the memorial, a year after Kai's death. "Fair for everyone," I repeated quietly, setting the cup of water beside the medicine. "What a generous thought, Sen." She laughed, a light, practiced sound. "Of course, sister-in-law. We are family, after all. What's fair for one should be fair for all." I did not argue with her that day. I had learned long ago that arguing with Sen was like arguing with weather, pointless and exhausting, and ultimately changing nothing about what was actually going to happen. Instead, I watched. I watched Mr. Tuok's visits become more frequent. I watched him bring documents wrapped in plastic folders, watched him speak to Kai in a low, patient voice about things like inheritance tax and family harmony and the importance of clarity, words that sounded reasonable on their own, but troubled me deeply when I considered who was saying them and why. I watched, too, the small bottle of pills that began appearing on Kai's bedside table, pills I had not prescribed and did not recognize, pills that Mr. Tuok had apparently recommended through Sen. "For his nerves," she said. "For his sleep. For the aches that came with growing old." I was a pharmacist for 31 years. I know medicine, the way a farmer knows the seasons, instinctively, in my bones. And there was something about those pills, something about the particular fog that settled over my husband's eyes an hour after he took them. Something that made the careful, sharp man I had married for 40 years go soft and pliable in a way that frightened me more than anything else had frightened me in our entire marriage. I said nothing to Kai about my suspicions. I did not want to frighten him, did not want to plant doubt about his own sister in his final years, when peace mattered more than almost anything else. Instead, I did something quieter. I began watching the calendar. I began noting which days Mr. Tuok visited, which days the strange new pills appeared on the bedside table, which days Kai seemed most confused, most agreeable, most unlike himself. And I began to understand, slowly, the way understanding always comes to me, not in a single flash but in a gradual accumulation of small observations, stacking one on top of another like bricks in a wall, that something was being built around my husband without his full awareness, something with a shape and a purpose I could not yet fully see, but could feel pressing against the edges of our life together, like water pressing against a dam. One evening, after Mr. Tuok had left, and Sen had gone home, and Kai sat dozing in his chair, with that particular fog still clouding his eyes, I went quietly to the altar room, and opened the wooden cabinet where we kept our most important papers. The box was still there, wrapped in red cloth, exactly where it had been for 2 years already, exactly where Kai had placed it himself on that ordinary Tuesday 5 years before he died. I did not open it. Not yet. It was not time yet. But I held it in my hands for a long moment, feeling its weight, feeling the small, sharp comfort of knowing it existed. And I thought of something my grandmother used to say about the patience of bamboo, how it bends in the strongest storms without breaking, how it survives by yielding exactly enough and not 1 inch more. I would yield. For now. I would watch and wait and say nothing. But I would not break. The first real sign came 3 weeks before Kai died, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, when the gutters overflowed and the courtyard turned to mud, and Mr. Tuok arrived anyway, his city shoes ruined by the time he reached our front door. I had gone to the market that morning, leaving Kai resting under his usual blanket of medicine-induced fog, and Sen had stayed to watch over him, which by then had become a regular arrangement, one I had stopped questioning out loud, even as my unease grew sharper with every passing week. I returned earlier than expected, the rain having driven away most of the market vendors before I finished my shopping. And I came through the back gate quietly, the way I always entered, my sandals making no sound against the wet stone path. I heard their voices before I saw them, drifting from the front room where Kai usually rested. He just needs to sign here. And here, Mr. Tuok was saying, his voice low and patient, the same tone he used with all of us, reasonable and unhurried. This page updates the property division. This page confirms the witnesses. It's all very standard. Will he understand what he's signing? Sen asked. And there was something in her voice I had never heard before, something that might almost have been hesitation, almost have been the last flicker of a conscience, not yet entirely extinguished. Does it matter? Mr. Tuok replied, and I stopped completely still in the kitchen doorway, the bag of vegetables suddenly heavy in my hands. He's agreeable when he's had his medicine. That's all we need. The witnesses we brought are reliable. They'll sign whatever we put in front of them. By the time anyone questions any of this, it will already be filed, already be official. These things become very difficult to undo once they're in the system. I do not remember setting the vegetables down. I remember only that my hands were suddenly empty, and that I was standing in the doorway to the front room, looking at my husband slumped in his chair with his eyes half closed, a pen resting loosely in his trembling fingers, a stack of papers spread across the low table in front of him, and Mr. Tuok kneeling beside him with the practiced patience of a man who had clearly done this exact thing before, in other houses, with other elderly people, whose minds had grown soft enough to bend. Senha saw me first. Her face went through 3 expressions in the space of a single second: surprise, then calculation, then a smooth, careful smile that did not reach her eyes. Sister-in-law, you're back early. The rain must have ended the market early. What is this? I asked, my voice quieter than I expected. Quiet the way it always became when something inside me had gone very cold and very still. Just some paperwork, Mr. Tuok said smoothly, gathering the papers with quick, practiced movements, sliding them back into his leather folder before I could see more than a blur of Kai's unsteady signature on the bottom of one page. Updating some property records. Standard procedure for families in your brother-in-law's position. He is my husband, I said. Not Sen's brother-in-law. My husband. Something flickered across Mr. Tuok's face, the smallest crack in his professional composure. There, and gone so quickly, I might have imagined it if I had not spent 31 years learning to read exactly such small, fleeting things. Of course, he said. My apologies. Your husband. I crossed the room and knelt beside Kai's chair, taking his hand in mine, the hand that had built shelves for my medicine bottles 45 years ago, the hand that had once been so steady and was now trembling with whatever those small unmarked pills had done to him over these past weeks. His eyes found mine slowly, as though swimming up through deep water to reach the surface. And for one brief, terrible moment, he looked at me the way a man looks when he is trying very hard to remember why something feels wrong, but cannot quite grasp the reason. Don't, he murmured, his voice thick and slow. I don't remember what I just. It's all right, I told him, my voice steady, even as something inside me was anything but steady. Rest now. I'm here. I looked up at Sen, who had the decency, at least, to look away from my eyes, and at Mr. Tuok, who had none of that decency at all, who simply gathered his papers and his leather folder with the calm efficiency of a man closing up shop for the day, already planning, no doubt, exactly when he would return. We'll come back another time, he said. When he's feeling better, they left into the rain, Sen's umbrella barely shielding either of them from the downpour, their footsteps splashing across the muddy courtyard toward the gate. I sat with Kai for a long time after they left, holding his hand as the fog slowly lifted from his eyes, as he became, gradually, more himself again, more the man I had married, until finally, he looked at me with something like clarity and asked what had happened, what he had been doing, why his head felt so strange. I did not tell him everything that day. I did not want to frighten him in his final weeks with the full shape of what I had witnessed. But that night, after he had fallen into a real sleep, not the medicated fog but actual, peaceful rest, I went alone to the altar room and stood before his parents' photographs and lit a single stick of incense, watching the smoke curl up into the darkness above the small flickering flame of the oil lamp. I thought of the box wrapped in red cloth, still waiting in the cabinet where it had waited for 2 years already. I thought of Sen's hesitation, that single flicker of something that might have been conscience, and I thought of Mr. Tuok's voice saying, "Does it matter?" So smooth, so practiced, the voice of a man who had clearly walked this same path through other families' grief before ours. The rain had not stopped. It drummed steadily against the tin roof above me, the same steady rhythm it had kept all afternoon, and somewhere, beneath that sound, I thought I heard something else. Something I could not quite name, a kind of waiting that had settled into the walls of this house, the way water settles into the deepest part of a riverbed. I did not yet know how far they intended to go. I did not yet know what they had already convinced Kai to sign on other rainy afternoons when I was not standing in the doorway to stop them. But I knew, standing there in the smoke and the lamplight, that whatever they were building behind my back had a foundation already laid, and that somewhere in this house, in some drawer or folder I had not yet discovered, there was already a piece of paper bearing my husband's unsteady signature, a piece of paper that was going to matter very much, very soon, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Kai died on a morning in early spring, 3 weeks after the rainy Thursday. I found him slumped over those papers, and I will not describe the details of his final hours, because some things belong only to the person who lived through them, held only in the private chambers of memory, that no audience needs to enter. I will say only that he was lucid in his last days, mostly free of the fog that had clouded him before, as though his body, sensing the end approaching, had finally released its grip on whatever those pills had been doing to him. I will say that he held my hand and called me by name, clearly, steadily, the way he always had, and that whatever doubt I carried about those rainy afternoon visits, I never once doubted the clarity of the man who said goodbye to me. The funeral lasted 7 days, the way funerals do in our district, drums and white cloth and incense burning continuously on the altar, relatives arriving from 3 provinces to pay their respects to a man who had served this commune faithfully for 2 decades. I moved through those 7 days, the way I imagine soldiers move through battle, on instinct alone, my body performing the rituals my mind had performed 1,000 times before for other families, while some deeper part of me remained somewhere else entirely, somewhere quiet and frozen, and far away. It was during the 2nd month after his death, while I was finally sorting through his papers, his old commune files, his correspondence, the accumulated documents of a long and careful life, that I found the bank passbook tucked inside a folder I had not opened in years. I sat on the floor of the front room with that small blue book in my hands, the afternoon light falling through the window in long golden bars across the tile, and I read the entries twice, then a 3rd time, certain I had misunderstood something. 6 withdrawals over the past 8 months, each one substantial. Each one made not by Kai but with a power of attorney document I had never seen before, never signed, never even known existed. The signature line bore Kai's name in handwriting that trembled exactly the way his hand had trembled on that rainy Thursday afternoon, exactly the way it trembled after those small unmarked pills had done their quiet work on him. The withdrawals totaled nearly 200 million dong. Money we had saved together over 4 decades. Money from the sale of our rice fields 3 years earlier that Kai had always said would go toward our son's children someday. Money that should have remained untouched in that account, exactly as we had left it. My hands were steady as I turned the pages, but something inside my chest had gone very cold, the way the surface of a pond goes still and hard in the deepest part of winter, ice forming, not because the water beneath has stopped moving, but because everything has simply slowed to a place where movement becomes invisible. I went to the bank the following morning, dressed in my plainest clothes, my hair pinned back the way it always was, an old woman asking quiet questions at a counter where I had done business for 30 years. The young clerk who helped me had grown up in this district, had once come into my pharmacy as a child with a fever, and she recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Stone," she said warmly, "how can I help you today?" I asked about the power of attorney, asked when it had been filed, asked who had been present as witnesses. She pulled up the records on her computer screen, her expression shifting slowly from polite helpfulness to something more careful, more hesitant, as she read what was in front of her. "This was filed 4 months ago," she said quietly. "Witnessed by a Mr. Lam Van Tuok and a Mrs. Vuthi Sen." There it was. Both of their names, side by side, official and stamped, sitting in the bank's records, as casually as any ordinary transaction, as though they had simply walked in one afternoon and rearranged the foundation of my entire life with nothing more than a few signatures and a pen. "There's something else," the clerk said, lowering her voice further, glancing toward her supervisor's office before continuing. "There was a visit to the bank just 2 weeks before your husband passed. Mrs. Sin came in with the documentation for a new will, asking our notary officer here for guidance on how the formal process works. She mentioned she was helping her brother get his affairs in order. A new will, not the original document Kai had shown me 5 years earlier, witnessed properly, sealed by the commune office, but something new, something built during the final months of his illness, during the very weeks I had watched that fog settle over his eyes after every visit from Mr. Tuok. I thanked the clerk for her help, gathered my passbook, and walked out into the bright morning sunlight, feeling as though the ground beneath my feet had shifted in some fundamental way, the way rice paddy soil shifts after the first heavy monsoon rain. Solid ground, suddenly revealing itself to be something far less solid than anyone had believed. They had not simply taken advantage of his confusion to push through some minor inheritance adjustment. They had built an entire structure, brick by careful brick, over months of patient visits and quiet manipulation, an entire architecture of theft disguised as family concern. And they had done it while I was in the next room, while I was preparing his medicine, while I was washing his clothes and rubbing liniment into his aching shoulders and believing, foolishly, that love alone would be enough to protect what we had built together. I stood on the bank steps for a long moment, the morning traffic moving past me, motorbikes and bicycles, and the occasional truck loaded with rice sacks, ordinary life continuing exactly as it always had, indifferent to the discovery that had just rearranged everything I understood about the people closest to me. 200 million dong, taken in secret. A new will, drafted in the final fog of his illness. And somewhere, in some office or drawer, a document waiting to be revealed at the proper moment, a document that would name my sister-in-law as something far more than a guest in this family story. I thought of an old saying my grandmother used to repeat when I was young, about how a tree's roots run deeper than anyone standing above the ground can see, how the most important parts of any living thing are often the parts hidden furthest from view. Whatever Sen and Mr. Tuok had built, they had built it underground, in the dark, where they believed no one was watching. But I had spent 40 years learning to read the things people tried to hide, and I was only just beginning to dig. I did not confront Sen. I did not call Mr. Tuok and demand explanations. I had learned long ago, behind that pharmacy counter, that the most dangerous mistake you can make with someone hiding something is to let them know you have started looking. Instead, I became very quiet, very patient, the way I had once watched a heron stand motionless at the edge of our rice paddy for an hour at a time, waiting without moving for exactly the right moment to strike. I continued my morning rituals exactly as expected. I lit incense every morning, swept the courtyard, accepted condolence visits from relatives and neighbors, with the same calm composure I had shown my entire life. And underneath all of it, I began to gather what I needed. My nephew on my own side of the family, my sister's son, had become a young lawyer in the provincial city. A serious, careful young man named Phúc, who had always shown me particular respect, perhaps because I had treated his childhood fevers and his mother's chronic cough for years, without ever once making the family feel burdened by the cost. I called him on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after my visit to the bank, and asked him to come see me when he next had time away from his office. He arrived the following weekend, driving the 2 hours from the city in his small second-hand car, and I made him tea in the kitchen while I explained, quietly and without embellishment, exactly what I had found. "Aunt," he said when I finished, setting down his cup with careful precision, "this is very serious. A power of attorney obtained while a person's mental clarity is compromised by medication, especially medication that wasn't prescribed by his actual physician, that can be challenged. And if there's a new will that contradicts an earlier, properly witnessed document, the courts will need to examine the circumstances of both very carefully. What do you need from me?" "Everything," he said. "The bank records you already have. Any record of his medical appointments during that period, especially anything showing he wasn't prescribed those pills you mentioned. Witnesses who can speak to his state of mind on specific days. And aunt, I need to know about that original document you mentioned, the one from 5 years ago. Where is it now?" I did not answer immediately. I rose from the table and walked to the altar room, Phúc following quietly behind me, and I opened the wooden cabinet, where the red-wrapped box had waited patiently through everything that had happened over the past 2 years. I had not opened it since the day Kai first showed it to me. I untied the cloth with hands that did not shake, though my heart was beating harder than it had in months, and inside lay a single folded document, its paper slightly yellowed with age, bearing Kai's careful handwriting, and, beneath it, the official red stamp of the commune office, along with 3 signatures: the village headman, Mr. Hoy, and 2 other witnesses I recognized as elders from our extended family, men who had since passed away themselves, their testimony now preserved only in ink and official seal. Fook read it carefully, his expression growing more focused with every line. "This is solid, Aunt. Properly witnessed, properly stamped. Exactly the kind of document that holds up against a later challenge, especially a later document obtained under questionable circumstances." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest, for the first time in months, the particular relief of finally setting down a weight you had been carrying so long you'd nearly forgotten its size. "There's something else I need to check," I told him. "I need to know exactly what is in this new will they filed, and I need to know who else witnessed Kai signing those withdrawal papers." Fook was thorough in the weeks that followed, working quietly through official channels, requesting records, speaking on contact at the provincial notary office, who owed him a favor from law school. What he uncovered confirmed everything I had already suspected, and revealed something more, besides. The new will, filed only 6 weeks before Kai's death, divided the house and land 70% to Sen and only 30% to me, framed as compensation for Sen's supposed years of devoted care for her ailing brother. Care that consisted, as far as I could determine, almost entirely, of bringing Mr. Tuok to our house on a regular basis. The witnesses listed on this new document were 2 names I did not recognize, and when Fook tracked one of them down, an elderly man living 3 communes over, the old farmer admitted, embarrassed and apologetic, that he had been paid a small sum to sign a document he never actually read, brought to him by a well-dressed man he had met only once. He told me it was just routine paperwork, the old farmer said when Fook visited him, said it was helping a family avoid arguments after a death. I needed the money for my grandson's school fees. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. I felt something fierce and quiet settle into my chest when Fook reported this to me, sitting across my kitchen table with his notebook full of careful documentation. It was not anger exactly, though anger lived somewhere underneath it. It was closer to the feeling of finally seeing the full shape of a disease after weeks of treating only its symptoms, the particular clarity that comes when confusion finally resolves into understanding. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now, we wait for the right moment," Fook said. "We don't want to alert them too early. We need everything documented, everything verified, before we make our move. And Aunt, there's something you should consider. The village headman, Mr. Hoy, the one who witnessed the original document 5 years ago. He's still alive, still respected throughout the commune. If this matter ever needs to be settled before the family, rather than only in a courtroom, his testimony would carry enormous weight." I thought of Mr. Hoy, an old friend of Kai's, a man who had sat at our table countless times over the decades, who had attended Kai's funeral and wept openly, unashamed, the way only the closest friends allow themselves to weep. "I will speak with him myself," I said, "when the time is right." That evening, after Fook had driven back to the city with his folder of careful notes, I sat alone in the altar room as I did every evening, lighting incense for my husband, watching the smoke rise and scatter in the evening air, drifting through the window. I thought of the proverb about bamboo bending in the storm without breaking, and I thought that perhaps I had misunderstood something about myself all these months. I was not simply bending. I was gathering strength in the bending. The way bamboo's flexibility is not weakness, but a different kind of strength entirely, one that allows it to survive storms that shatter rigid trees, standing proud and inflexible beside it. Sen believed she had already won. She moved through the house in those weeks with new confidence, mentioning her homestay plans to neighbors, discussing renovation costs with a contractor from the next town over, behaving in every way like a woman who had already secured everything she believed was owed to her. Let her believe it a little longer. I had learned patience behind a pharmacy counter for 31 years, watching illnesses develop and resolve, watching the body's own quiet processes work toward healing in their own necessary time. This, too, would resolve in its own necessary time. I simply needed to be ready when it did. The Memorial Day finally arrived, the one-year anniversary that brought every relative from 3 provinces back to this house. The same gathering where Sen had stood before 40 witnesses and told me to move into the back room. I want to take you back to that morning now, to fill in what happened in the hours and days immediately surrounding it, because what came next happened faster than I expected, faster and more brazenly than even my careful preparation had anticipated. Sen arrived 2 days before the official memorial, ostensibly to help with preparations, though I noticed almost immediately that her idea of helping involved walking through every room of the house with a small notebook, jotting measurements, discussing wall colors with herself in a low murmur, as though I were not standing 15 feet away, listening to every word. The front room would make a lovely reception area, she said to no one in particular, running her hand along the carved wooden cabinet that had belonged to Kai's grandfather. Tourists love authentic details like this. We could keep some of the old furniture for character. I said nothing. I continued preparing offerings for the altar, arranging fruit in the particular pattern Kai's mother had taught me decades ago. 5 different fruits representing the 5 elements. A tradition, older than either of us, older than this house itself. Mr. Tuok arrived the morning of the memorial itself, which struck me as unusual, since lawyers rarely attended family memorial ceremonies unless they had specific business to conduct. He wore a dark suit instead of his usual casual visiting clothes, and he carried his leather briefcase with a particular formality that made my pulse quicken, though I kept my face perfectly composed as I greeted him at the gate. "Mrs. Doan," he said, bowing slightly, his voice carrying that same smooth professional patience I had heard through the wall on that rainy Thursday afternoon. "I hope you don't mind my attending." Sen thought it would be appropriate for me to be present, given certain family matters that may need discussion today. "Of course," I said, my voice as even and pleasant as his own. "Family matters are always welcome to be discussed openly, Mr. Tuok." Something flickered behind his eyes, the smallest hesitation, as though my words carried a weight he hadn't quite expected, though he recovered quickly, smiling and moving past me into the courtyard, where relatives were already beginning to gather. The ceremony proceeded exactly as such. Ceremonies always do, the monk chanting before the altar, incense burning thick and fragrant, relatives bowing in turn before Kai's photograph, the particular solemn rhythm of grief observed properly, formally, the way our traditions require. I moved through it with the same composure I had carried through his funeral itself, my hands steady, my voice steady, while underneath that composure, something coiled tight and waiting, the way a spring coils before release. It was after the formal ceremony, during the meal that followed, that Sen made her move, standing up from her seat at the long table, set up in the courtyard, tapping her teacup with a spoon, to draw everyone's attention the way someone might tap a glass before an important announcement at a wedding. "Since we're all gathered here together," she began, her voice carrying easily across the courtyard, "I think it's time we discussed some practical matters. My brother, may his spirit rest peacefully, left certain instructions before he passed. Instructions about how the family's affairs should be settled." I felt 40 pairs of eyes shift toward me, then back toward Sen, the particular charged silence of a family sensing conflict, approaching like weather on the horizon. "Mr. Tuok has the documentation here," Sen continued, gesturing toward the lawyer, who rose with practiced ease and opened his leather briefcase on the table, producing a folder of papers with theatrical efficiency. "My brother's final will, properly executed, dividing the family property, according to his true wishes." This was the moment, I understood, that Sen had been building toward for months. Not simply moving me into the back room as a private family matter, handled quietly between 2 women in a kitchen somewhere, but doing it here, publicly, with legal documentation presented before the entire extended family, establishing her claim so thoroughly, so officially, that I would have no room left to object without appearing to dishonor my own husband's final wishes in front of everyone who had loved him. It was, I had to admit, watching it unfold, a clever strategy. Cruel, but clever. This document, Mr. Tuok said, holding up the papers for the gathered relatives to see, though not close enough for anyone to actually read the small print, clearly establishes that 70% of the property goes to Mrs. Sen, in recognition of her devote and nasa, shinas, while the remaining 30% provides comfortable support for Mrs. Doan in her remaining years. A murmur moved through the gathered relatives, uncertain, uncomfortable, the particular sound a crowd makes when they sense something is wrong but cannot yet articulate exactly what. This was Kai's wish, Sen said, her voice softening now, taking on the particular tone of grieving sincerity she had perfected over the past year. He told me himself, in his final months, that he wanted to make sure I was taken care of, that I had sacrificed so much caring for him, while sister-in-law was so often occupied with other matters. I felt the old women at the table glance toward me, some with sympathy, some, I noticed, with the particular curiosity of people wondering whether there might be some truth buried in Sen's accusation, whether perhaps I had indeed been less attentive than I should have been during my husband's final illness. It was, I understood in that moment, a masterful piece of theater, designed not simply to claim property but to claim the narrative itself, to position Sen as the devoted sister and myself as somehow negligent, somehow deserving of whatever diminished position they had decided to assign me. I rose slowly from my seat, the courtyard falling quiet around me, every eye now turned in my direction, waiting to see how I would respond to this carefully orchestrated ambush. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue, did not protest, did not even glance toward the document Mr. Tuok still held aloft like some kind of trophy. Sen, I said quietly, my voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, the way quiet voices often carry further than shouting ever could. You have built quite an elaborate story today, in front of quite a large audience. Her confidence flickered, just slightly. The smallest crack in her carefully maintained composure. It is not a story, sister-in-law. It is the truth, properly documented. I looked at her for a long moment, then at Mr. Tuok, then at the gathered faces of relatives who had known Kai and me for decades, who had attended our wedding, who had watched us build this house and this life together brick by careful brick. I will not argue with you here, today, in front of everyone, I said. Grief has made stranger things happen in families than what we are seeing today. But I will say this, my husband and I built everything in this house together, with our own hands, over 40 years. Whatever document you are holding, Sen, it will need to answer to something far older than itself. I turned and walked back into the house, leaving the courtyard, murmuring behind me, leaving Sen standing with her teacup and her carefully prepared speech, leaving Mr. Tuok holding his folder of papers with the first genuine uncertainty I had seen cross his face since the day I met him. I walked directly to the altar room, knelt before my husband's photograph, and for the first time since his death, I allowed myself to weep, not from weakness, but from the particular grief of understanding, fully, finally, exactly how far his own sister had been willing to go. I want to tell you now about the thing that broke my heart more completely than anything else in this entire ordeal. More than the stolen money, more than the false will, more even than Sen's public theater in our own courtyard. I want to tell you about what Fook discovered in the final days before everything came to its conclusion, the piece of the truth that I had suspected but had not allowed myself to fully believe until the evidence sat in front of me, undeniable, in black and white. Fook came to me alone, 2 days after the memorial ceremony, his face carrying an expression I had not seen on him before, something between anger and grief, the particular look of a young person confronting cruelty for the first time in a way that shatters whatever remaining innocence they had carried into adulthood. "Aunt," he said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table, "I need to show you something, and I need you to prepare yourself before I do." He laid out a series of documents he had gathered over the past weeks, medical records obtained through a contact at the district hospital, prescription histories, and finally, the thing that made my hands go cold as I held it. A handwritten note found among papers. Mr. Tuok had carelessly left at the home of the elderly farmer he had paid to witness the false will. Papers the old farmer had kept out of confusion rather than malice, simply not knowing what to do with documents that didn't seem to belong to him. The note, in Mr. Tuok's own handwriting, detailed a dosing schedule. Sedatives, stronger than anything any doctor in our district would have prescribed for an aging man with Kai's heart condition, timed deliberately around scheduled visits, calculated not to harm him outright, but to render him compliant, agreeable, easily guided toward whatever signature was needed that particular day. He wasn't just confused. Aunt, Fuck said quietly, his voice carrying the careful gentleness of someone delivering news he knows will cause pain. He was being deliberately medicated to make him more suggestible. This wasn't an old man's natural confusion near the end of his life. This was something done to him, on purpose, by people who understood exactly what they were doing, and exactly how dangerous it was for a man with his heart condition. I sat very still, the note trembling slightly in my hands, though my voice remained steady when I finally spoke. How long? The dates on this schedule go back nearly 5 months before he died, Aunt. Almost the entire final stretch of his illness, 5 months. Nearly half a year during which I had watched my husband grow more confused, more distant, more unlike himself, and had attributed it entirely to the natural progression of age and illness, had blamed myself in quiet moments for not recognizing sooner that something was wrong, had wondered, in my darkest hours of grief, whether I had somehow failed him by not noticing his decline more clearly. It had not been decline at all. It had been deliberate, calculated theft of the very clarity that had defined my husband's entire character, the careful, steady mind that had settled land disputes, and built shelves with patient precision, and written careful letters. To a young pharmacist 45 years ago, they had taken that from him, piece by piece, dose by dose, not to ease his pain but to make him easier to manipulate, and they had done it while smiling at me across the dinner table, while bringing fruit from the market, while sitting beside his bed asking about his health with voices full of false concern. I thought of those final weeks. The moments when Kai's eyes had cleared after the funeral preparations had given his body time to release whatever chemicals had been pressed into it, moments when he had looked at me with something like apology in his expression, as though some part of him understood that something had been taken from him, without his full consent, even if he couldn't quite articulate what. I thought of an old saying about water, about how the gentlest substance in the world can wear away even the hardest stone, given enough time and enough patience, not through force but through persistent, quiet erosion. They had used that same patient erosion against my husband's mind, against his will, against the very foundation of who he was, wearing him down dose by careful dose, until he became someone who would sign whatever was placed in front of him. This was not simply theft of property. This was theft of the man himself, of his final months, of his right to make decisions about his own life and his own legacy with a clear and unclouded mind. They had stolen something from him that no amount of land or money could ever replace: his agency, his dignity, the simple human right to understand what he was signing and why. I wept then, fully, the way I had not allowed myself to weep even at his funeral, sitting at my kitchen table with Fuchs' careful hand resting gently on my shoulder, the documents spread before me, like evidence of a crime far deeper than any inheritance dispute, a crime against the very essence of the man I had loved for 45 years. Aunt, Fuchs said quietly, after giving me time to weep, this changes everything. This isn't simply a contested inheritance anymore. This is evidence of elder exploitation, of deliberate medical manipulation. This could be a criminal matter, not just a civil one. I wiped my eyes and looked at the documents again, at Mr. Tuok's careful handwriting detailing exactly how much sedative, exactly when, exactly how to keep an old man compliant without making him obviously incapacitated to anyone who might be watching closely. But I had been watching closely. I had simply not yet understood, fully, what I was watching. "What do we do with this?" I asked. Fook was quiet for a long moment, considering. "We could take this directly to the police. It would likely result in charges against Mr. Tuok, possibly against Sen as well, for conspiracy." I thought about that path, about courtrooms and police stations, and the particular public spectacle that would follow, about my husband's name becoming attached to scandal and criminal proceedings in his final legacy, about the village, watching this family's grief turned into gossip, and speculation for months or years to come. "No," I said finally, my voice steadier now than I expected it to be. "Not yet. Perhaps not at all, if there's another way. Aunt, I don't understand. They drugged him. They manipulated a dying man into signing away his own family's legacy." "I understand exactly what they did, Fook," I said, folding the documents carefully, my hands no longer trembling. "And they will answer for it, but not in a courtroom full of strangers who never knew my husband, who never understood what kind of man he truly was. They will answer before the people who actually loved him. They will answer before this village, before the elders who watched him grow into the man he became, before everyone who attended his funeral and wept for him honestly." I rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the courtyard, where the memorial ceremony had taken place only 2 days before, where Sen had stood with her teacup and her false document, certain she had already won. "There is a saying," I told Fook, "about how a tree that bends in the storm survives, while the rigid tree that refuses to bend often shatters instead. I have been bending for many months now, Fook, watching, gathering, saying nothing while they built their false foundation brick by brick." I turned back to face him, and whatever grief had been in my expression a few minutes earlier had hardened now into something else entirely, something quiet and absolutely certain. But bending is not the same as breaking, and the time for bending is nearly finished. The days that followed Fook's discovery passed with a particular quality of stillness, the kind of quiet that settles over a rice paddy in the hour before a typhoon makes landfall, when the air grows thick and heavy, and even the birds seem to understand that something significant is approaching, falling silent in the trees that will soon bend nearly to breaking in the coming wind. I did not confront Sen. I did not call Mr. Tuok to accuse him of what I now knew with absolute certainty he had done. I continued, instead, to move through my days exactly as I had for the past several months, lighting incense each morning, accepting condolence visits, allowing Sen to believe that her courtyard performance had succeeded exactly as planned, that an old woman had been sufficiently cowed by legal documentation and family pressure to accept whatever diminished position they had decided to assign her. But behind that careful composure, I was preparing for something far more significant than a quiet retreat into the back room. I went to visit Mr. Hoy, the village headman, on a quiet Tuesday morning, carrying with me a small gift of tea and the particular gravity of a woman about to ask for something important. He received me in his front room. An old man now in his 70s, his hands age-spotted but his mind as sharp as it had been when he witnessed Kai's original will 5 years earlier. "Doan," he said warmly, settling into his chair across from me. "It has been too long since you visited. How are you managing? All alone in that big house?" "Not as alone as some people might prefer," I said carefully, and watched understanding move slowly across his weathered face as I explained. Piece by piece, everything Fuck had uncovered over the past weeks. The stolen money, the fraudulent power of attorney, the new will built on false witnesses paid to sign documents they never read. And finally, the dosing schedule, the deliberate manipulation of my husband's mind in his final months. Mr. Hoy's expression darkened steadily as I spoke, his jaw tightening, his hands curling into fists against the arms of his chair, an old man's quiet fury, more dangerous for its restraint than any shouting could have been. "I witnessed his true will myself," he said when I finished, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent decades settling disputes and understood exactly how seriously such matters should be treated. I sat in that very altar room and watched Kai explain his wishes clearly, calmly, with his full understanding. What they have done since, drugging him, forcing false signatures. This is not simply a family disagreement, Don. This is a violation of everything our traditions hold sacred about honoring the dead and protecting the elderly. I know, I said quietly, which is why I need your help, Mr. Hoy. Not in a courtroom in the city, where strangers will judge a man and woman they never knew. I need this matter settled here, in this village, before the people who actually understood my husband and the life we built together. He was quiet for a long moment, considering, his eyes moving toward the window where the afternoon light fell across his small courtyard. The death anniversary gathering, he said finally. The full extended family will assemble again in 3 weeks, won't they? For the formal anniversary ceremony at the family shrine. Yes, then that is when this should be resolved. Properly, before witnesses, with all the dignity such a serious matter deserves. He looked at me directly, his expression softening slightly. I will be there, Doan, as I always am, and I will speak the truth about what I witnessed 5 years ago, if it becomes necessary. I thanked him and walked home through the late afternoon light, past rice paddies turning gold in the slanting sun, past neighbors who nodded to me with the particular respect our small community always showed an elder widow. Unaware of the storm, I was quietly assembling behind my calm exterior. That evening, I retrieved the wooden box from the altar cabinet one final time, untying the red cloth carefully, examining the document inside under the warm light of the oil lamp. Kai's careful handwriting, the official stamp of the commune office, 3 signatures, including Mr. Hoy's own, preserved exactly as they had been 5 years ago, waiting patiently through everything that had happened since for exactly this moment. I thought of Kai's voice that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, asking me to come witness something he said I would need someday. He had known, even then, perhaps not the specific shape the danger would take, but he had known his sister's hunger well enough to prepare for it, to build a foundation strong enough to withstand whatever storm might eventually come. I called Fuck that night and explained my plan. The death anniversary gathering, Mr. Hoy's promised testimony, the careful timing required to ensure maximum impact with minimum unnecessary cruelty, justice without spectacle, truth without humiliation, beyond what truth itself would naturally require. Are you certain about this approach, Aunt? Fook asked. A courtroom would guarantee a clean legal resolution. This approach, in front of the family, it carries more uncertainty. Some things matter more than legal cleanliness, Fook, I told him. Kai built his entire life around this community, around the trust of the people who knew him. Whatever justice comes for what was done to him should come from within, that same community, witnessed by the same people who loved him honestly. After we hung up, I sat alone in the altar room for a long while, watching the incense smoke rise and curl toward the ceiling, listening to the wind moving through the bamboo grove behind the house, the same steady rustling I had listened to for 45 years of marriage, the same sound that had filled countless ordinary evenings when Kai sat reading by lamplight, while I sat across from him in comfortable silence. I retied the red cloth around the document carefully, returning it to its box, but I did not return it to the cabinet. Instead, I placed it in a drawer in my own bedroom, close at hand, ready. 3 weeks remained until the death anniversary ceremony. 3 weeks during which Sen would continue believing she had already won, continuing her renovation plans, continuing to speak confidently with contractors about homestay conversions and reception areas. 3 weeks during which I would continue my quiet preparations, gathering every piece of evidence Fook had assembled, confirming every detail of Mr. Hoy's planned testimony, ensuring that when the moment finally arrived, there would be no possibility of denial, no room for Sen's smooth explanations, or Mr. Tuok's practiced reasonableness. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably as evening deepened into night, rattling the bamboo grove with unusual force, the particular restless energy that sometimes precedes a real storm moving in from the coast. I sat in the darkness of the altar room, listening to that wind grow stronger, feeling something in my own chest grow correspondingly steadier, correspondingly certain. Sen believed the storm had already passed. that her victory in the courtyard had settled everything in her favor for good. She had no understanding, none at all, of what was actually gathering on the horizon, building strength quietly in the dark, the way real storms always do, far out at sea, long before anyone standing safely on shore notices the sky beginning to change color. The death anniversary ceremony arrived on a clear morning in early summer, the sky a hard, bright blue overhead, the kind of sky that seems to promise honesty, as though even the weather understood that today required clarity rather than concealment. Relatives began arriving from early morning, the same 40 or so faces that had gathered for the one-year memorial, filling the courtyard with their familiar mixture of solemnity and quiet conversation, children running between the legs of adults, the smell of cooking drifting from the kitchen where neighbor women helped prepare the ceremonial offerings. I moved through the morning's preparations exactly as I always did, arranging fruit on the altar in the careful pattern Kai's mother had taught me, lighting the first sticks of incense as the sun climbed higher above the bamboo grove. Sen arrived mid-morning, dressed again in fine silk, her confidence fully restored after weeks of believing her courtyard victory had settled everything permanently in her favor. She had brought Mr. Tuok again, dressed in another dark formal suit, his leather briefcase tucked under his arm, with the same practiced casualness he always carried, as though important documents were simply an ordinary accessory for a man of his profession. I had asked Mr. Hoy to arrive slightly earlier than the other guests, and he sat now in a place of honor near the altar, his presence so ordinary and expected at any village gathering that no one, especially not Sen, thought to question why the village headman might be paying particularly close attention to the day's proceedings. The formal ceremony unfolded with its usual solemnity, the monks chanting, rising and falling above the smoke of burning incense, each relative bowing in turn before Kai's photograph, the particular rhythm of remembrance, observed exactly as tradition required. I knelt before the altar last, as the widow always does, pressing my palms together, bowing 3 times, and as I rose, I allowed myself one private moment, speaking silently to my husband's photograph, asking for nothing except the steadiness I had carried with me through every difficult moment of my life. It was after the formal ceremony, as relatives gathered for the meal that traditionally follows, that I rose from my seat and asked, quietly but clearly enough for the gathered family to hear, whether I might speak before the meal began. The courtyard fell into the particular attentive silence that follows an unexpected request from someone known for never making unexpected requests. Sen's expression flickered with something between curiosity and unease, perhaps sensing the way animals sometimes sense weather changing before any visible sign appears, that something in the air had shifted since the last time we had all gathered together. 1 year ago, I began, my voice carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. Almost to this very week, Sen stood in this same space and told me, in front of many of you, that I should move into the back room of my own house, that she had decided to convert the front of our family home into accommodations for tourists. A murmur moved through the gathered relatives, the particular sound of people recalling an uncomfortable memory they had perhaps preferred to forget. I said nothing that day, I continued. Some of you may have wondered why. Perhaps some of you believed I had simply accepted my circumstances, that an old widow had no strength left to fight for what was rightfully hers and her husband's. I paused, letting the silence stretch, watching Sen's hand tighten slightly around her teacup, watching Mr. Tuok shift almost imperceptibly in his seat, the first crack in his professional composure I had seen since that very first afternoon. He walked into our front room with his leather briefcase and his patient, reasonable voice. I was not accepting anything, I said. I was watching. I have spent 40 years learning to watch carefully, to notice the things people hope will go unnoticed. And in this past year, I have watched and gathered and waited for exactly this moment. I gestured to Phuc, who had arrived quietly an hour earlier, and now stepped forward from the edge of the courtyard, carrying a folder of documents he had prepared with such meticulous care over the past months. My nephew is a lawyer in the city, I said, and what he discovered with the help of records from our own district bank, our own commune office, and the honest testimony of people who were misled into participating in something they did not fully understand, paints a very different picture than the one Sen presented to all of you on this very spot 1 year ago. I watched the color drain slowly from Sen's face as Fook began to speak, laying out the evidence piece by piece before the gathered relatives. The bank records, showing nearly 200 million dong withdrawn through a power of attorney I had never signed. The false will, drafted in the final weeks of Kai's illness, naming witnesses who had never actually read what they were signing. "This is outrageous," Sen said, finding her voice finally, though it carried a brittle quality that hadn't been there a moment before. "These are lies, fabrications meant to discredit me in front of the family. Are they?" I asked quietly, and turned to Mr. Hoy, who rose slowly from his seat, his weathered face grave, with the particular authority that comes from decades of settling exactly this kind of dispute. "I witnessed Kai's true will myself," Mr. Hoy said, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtyard, 5 years before he died, in this very altar room, when his mind was clear and his intentions were entirely his own. "I have known this family for over 40 years. I attended Kai's funeral. I wept for him, honestly, as did everyone gathered here today." He paused, looking directly at Sen. "What I have just heard described, the medication, the false witnesses, the document drafted while a dying man's mind was deliberately clouded. This is not a family disagreement. This is a betrayal of everything our traditions hold sacred." Mr. Tuok rose then, attempting to recover some professional composure. "Mr. Hoy, with respect, you weren't present for these later arrangements. You cannot speak to circumstances you didn't witness yourself." "No," I said, stepping forward, my voice steady and clear, "but I can." I reached into the bag I had carried with me all morning and withdrew the documents Fook had given me, the dosing schedule found among Mr. Tuok's careless papers, the handwriting, unmistakably his own, detailing exactly when and how much sedative to administer before each scheduled visit, calculated precisely to make a dying man compliant without appearing obviously incapacitated. I held it up, not shouting, not even raising my voice particularly, simply allowing the document to speak for itself in the absolute silence that had fallen over the entire courtyard. "This is Mr. Tuok's own handwriting," I said. "A schedule for administering medication my husband's actual doctor never prescribed, timed specifically around visits, meant to obtain his signature on documents he could not have fully understood while under its influence." I looked directly at Sen, whose composure had finally, completely collapsed, her teacup trembling visibly in her hand. "You told him I was too occupied with other matters to properly care for him in his final months," I said quietly. "But I was here every single day, Sen." I measured his medicine. I rubbed liniment into his shoulders. I held his hand through every difficult night. The only thing I failed to notice in time was that someone else was secretly drugging him every time you brought your friend through our front door. What happened next unfolded with the particular swiftness of a structure finally giving way, after months of slow, invisible erosion beneath its surface, the way a riverbank that has been quietly undermined by current finally collapses all at once, though the actual collapse had been building, unseen, for a very long time. Mr. Tuok made the first mistake, the one that would ultimately unravel everything Sen had spent so long trying to construct. In his panic, watching the gathered relatives' faces shift from confusion to dawning horror, he turned towards Sen with an expression that abandoned every trace of his careful professional composure. "This wasn't my idea," he said, his voice cracking with the particular desperation of a man realizing his carefully constructed reputation was collapsing in real time before an audience of 40 witnesses. "Seng came to me. She knew about her brother's wealth, knew he had no will favoring her, asked me specifically how we might arrange things differently while there was still time. The medication schedule. That was her suggestion too, something her husband had used once on his own elderly mother years ago, to manage an inheritance dispute." The courtyard erupted into a low, horrified murmur. the particular sound of an extended family witnessing a complete unmasking. Every careful assumption about their relationships rearranging itself in real time. "That's not true," Sen said. But her voice had lost all its earlier confidence, had become thin and frightened. The voice of someone watching their last possible defense crumbling in their own hands. "He's lying to protect himself." "Am I?" Mr. Tuok said, turning on her now with the particular cruelty of a man trying to save himself by sacrificing his accomplice. "You came to my office in the city 8 months ago, Sen. You told me your brother was dying, and that you deserved compensation for years of family sacrifice he had never properly acknowledged. You're the one who suggested the medication. I simply provided the legal framework to make the documents appear proper." "Stop," Sen said, her hands rising to cover her face, the silk sleeves of her good blouse trembling visibly. "Just stop." But the damage was already complete, spreading through the gathered relatives like fire through dry grass. Each new revelation igniting fresh outrage among people who had known Kai for decades, who had loved him honestly, who now understood with growing horror exactly what had been done to him in his final, vulnerable months. An elderly aunt, Kai's father's youngest sister, rose from her seat near the back of the courtyard, her voice trembling with anger as she spoke. "I held that baby boy when he was born," she said, gesturing toward Kai's photograph on the altar. "I watched him grow into the most honest man this commune has ever produced. And you," she turned toward Sen, "you drugged him in his final months, manipulated him while he was dying, and then stood in this same courtyard and lectured his widow about moving into the back room." Other voices joined hers. Cousins and uncles and old family friends who had attended every gathering for decades. Their collective grief finding focus now in righteous anger, the particular fury of a community discovering that one of their own had betrayed not just an individual, but the entire fabric of trust and respect that held their extended family together. Mr. Hoy raised his hand, and the courtyard gradually quieted, deferring automatically to his decades of authority as village headman. "This matter is now extremely serious," he said, his voice grave and measured. "What has been described here today? Deliberate medication of a dying man to manipulate his legal decisions, theft of family resources through fraudulent power of attorney, false witnesses paid to sign documents under deception. These are not simply family matters to be settled with private apology. These are crimes against an elder, against the dignity of someone no longer able to protect himself." "Please," Sen said, her composure entirely gone now, tears streaming down her face, though I could not tell, watching her, whether they came from genuine remorse or simply from the terror of complete exposure. "Please, sister-in-law, I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted what I felt I deserved. After everything, after years of watching my own life fall apart while you and Kai built something so solid." I looked at her for a long moment. This woman I had known for 45 years, who had eaten countless meals at my table, who had cried at her brother's funeral, whose resentment had apparently been growing quietly in the dark for decades, waiting for exactly the right circumstances to finally bloom into something this destructive. I thought of her words to me, 1 year ago, in this same courtyard. "You're getting old, sister-in-law. Living alone in a house this big is a waste. Starting tomorrow, you move to the back room." I had said nothing then. I had simply smiled and let the silence stand as my only answer, because I had already known, even in that moment, that the truth would eventually speak far more powerfully than any argument I could offer in the heat of confrontation. "You called me a waste of space in my own home," I said quietly now, my voice carrying easily across the silenced courtyard. "You decided, on your own, that an old woman's presence meant nothing compared to your renovation plans. But Sen, this house was never simply a building to be measured and divided according to your convenience. Every brick was placed by your brother's own hands. Every wall holds 45 years of a life we built together, honestly, patiently, the way the old proverbs teach us to build anything worth keeping." I gestured toward Mr. Hoy, toward the document I had retrieved that morning from my bedroom drawer, and now held carefully in my hands, its red cloth wrapping finally untied, before this entire gathered family. "This is your brother's true will," I said. "Witnessed by Mr. Hoy himself 5 years ago. Properly stamped by our commune office. Signed while Kai's mind was completely his own. It says exactly what any reasonable person would expect, that the house and land remain mine, that provisions are made for our son's children, and that you, Sen, as his sister, would receive a respectful portion as well. Enough to live comfortably, offered freely, without any need for deception or manipulation." I let that settle over the courtyard. The simple, devastating truth that everything Sen had risked, the months of careful manipulation, the medication, the false witnesses, the public theater of righteous victimhood, all of it had been entirely unnecessary, because Kai had already intended to provide for her honestly, generously, before any of this began. "You could have simply waited," I said quietly. "You could have simply trusted that your brother loved you enough to take care of you properly. Instead, you chose to steal what was already going to be given freely. And in doing so, you lost something far more valuable than any portion of this house could ever have been worth." Sen sank back into her chair, her face buried in her hands. The sound of her crying, the only noise in the otherwise silent courtyard, while beside her, Mr. Tuok gathered his leather briefcase with shaking hands, already calculating, no doubt, how quickly he might extract himself from a situation that had just transformed from a profitable arrangement into something approaching criminal exposure. In the weeks that followed the death anniversary ceremony, the matter resolved itself with far less drama than the confrontation itself might have suggested. The particular quiet aftermath that follows any real storm, when the wind finally dies down and people begin the patient work of assessing what remains and what must be rebuilt. Mr. Tuok disappeared from our district entirely within days. His provincial law license eventually suspended after Mr. Hoy formally reported the matter to the appropriate authorities, his name becoming, I later heard, a quiet warning passed between notary offices throughout the region, a cautionary tale about exactly the kind of predatory arrangement he had built his reputation exploiting. Sen did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that, because some who hear this story might expect a harsher ending, might want to see her punished with the full weight the law could potentially bring against her. But Mr. Hoy and I spoke at length in the days following the ceremony, and we agreed, ultimately, that what our family needed was not further public humiliation, but genuine accountability, and, eventually, the possibility of repair. Sen returned the money she had taken, every dong of it, drawing from savings she had apparently kept hidden even from her own husband, money that suggested perhaps she had been planning some version of this scheme for far longer than the months immediately surrounding Kai's illness. She moved away from our district entirely, settling in a smaller commune 2 provinces over where her grown daughter lived, beginning what I understood to be a quiet, humbled version of the life she had once imagined for herself. I did not become wealthy through any of this. I want to be clear about that, because this was never a story about money. Despite everything that happened around inheritance and property and stolen funds, I remained exactly as comfortable as I had always been, living in the same house Kai and I had built together, tending the same small garden, continuing my quiet morning rituals exactly as I had for decades. What I gained instead was something far more valuable than any expanded portion of land or property. I gained back my husband's dignity, the truth of who he actually was in his final months, a man whose mind had been deliberately clouded against his will, but whose true intentions, recorded honestly 5 years before his illness ever began, finally stood, vindicated, before the entire community that had known and respected him. I gained, too, something I had not expected, a renewed closeness with relatives I had grown somewhat distant from over the years, cousins and aunts and uncles who now visited more frequently, who spoke more openly about Kai's memory, who seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, exactly what kind of quiet strength I had carried through 45 years of marriage and the difficult year that followed his death. Our son returned from the city more often after everything settled, bringing his own children to visit their grandmother, to walk through the rooms their grandfather had built, to learn, slowly, the particular history embedded in every wall and beam of this old house. I told them stories some evenings, sitting in the front room where Sen had once stood with her teacup announcing my supposed eviction, stories about their grandfather's quiet steadiness, about the shelves he had built before we were even married, about the particular way he showed love, not through grand declarations, but through patient, careful action sustained across decades. On the second anniversary of Kai's death, I stood once again before the family altar, lighting incense, watching the familiar smoke rise and curl toward the ceiling, carrying with it the same scent of sandalwood and memory that had filled this room for 45 years. The fruit was arranged in its proper pattern, 5 elements honoring traditions far older than any of the conflicts that had nearly torn our family apart. I thought, standing there in the quiet morning light, of something my mother used to tell me when I was young, an old saying about still water running deepest, words I had repeated silently to myself. On the very morning this entire story began, standing in this same room, while Sen announced my supposed banishment to the back of my own house, I understood now, fully, what my mother had truly meant by those words, understood it in a way I could not have grasped as a young bride. Simply hearing the saying repeated, without yet having lived enough to know its true weight. Still, water does not announce its depth through noise or turbulence. It simply remains, patient and clear, allowing whatever truth lies beneath its surface to eventually become visible to anyone willing to look closely enough and wait long enough for the surface to settle. I had been that still water through every difficult month of this past year, through grief and discovery and quiet preparation, through the careful gathering of evidence and the patient waiting for exactly the right moment to let truth finally surface before the people who mattered most. I bowed 3 times before Kai's photograph, the familiar ritual grounding me the way it always had, and I allowed myself, finally, a genuine smile. Not the small, knowing smile I had offered Sen 1 year earlier in this same room, but something warmer, something closer to peace. "We did it," I said quietly, speaking to his photograph the way I often did in these private morning moments. "Your family's name remains honest. Your true wishes stand exactly as you intended them, witnessed and protected, just as you knew they would need to be someday." Outside, the wind moved gently through the bamboo grove behind our house, the same steady, familiar sound that had filled countless ordinary evenings throughout our marriage, neither violent nor dramatic, simply present, simply continuing, the way truth itself continues quietly beneath the surface of things, until the moment it finally needs to be seen. I thought of myself as I had been that morning a year ago, standing perfectly still while Sen delivered her cruel announcement before 40 witnesses, smiling that small, private smile, while everyone in the room wondered what exactly I understood that they did not. "Still water runs deepest," I told myself once more, watching the incense smoke drift slowly toward the open window, carrying its quiet message somewhere beyond the walls of this house that had finally, fully, become entirely my own again. It always had been. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, if your own family ever made you feel like a burden instead of a blessing, I hope this story reminded you of something important. Quiet strength is still strength. Patience is not the same as weakness, and the truth has a way of surfacing exactly when it's needed most. If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. There's a new story like this one waiting for you every single day. Have you ever had to stay silent and wait for the truth to come out on its own, and if so, what finally brought it to light?